Hello and welcome to Sunday School with First Baptist Church of Greensboro. My name is Reverend Courtney Willis and I'm so glad that you are here. By way of housekeeping, I'll let you know that usually I have a little lapel mic that I put on my shirt or dress, and I forgot it today. So the sound may be just a little bit different today than what you're used to, but I promise by next week I'll have that lapel mic and it'll sound just like it always does. So might be a little bit echoey in here today, but hopefully it's not too painful to watch. We are here in the midst of Advent, friends. This is so wonderful. We're getting ready to enter, or today, the third week of Advent, the week when we celebrate the joy that Christ brings us. And today we're going to continue in our formations literature, particularly talking about the women in Jesus's genealogy. And so, in order to get us thinking about one of those women today, I'd love for you to answer this question. When have you been an outsider? When have you been an outsider in any place or time in your life? Go ahead and answer that if you're watching on Facebook, or you can answer it to someone close by, or just to yourself. When have you been an outsider? Think on that for just a moment. Today's passage tells the end of a story of this woman, Ruth, that we're going to look at today. A much more familiar character probably in the Bible than the last two that we've talked about. And we're skipping toward the end of her story, but skipping to the end removes the drama and the risk and the uncertainty that really is involved in the choices that Ruth makes and what gets her on the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So we'll still talk about what gets us to the passage that we're going to read today. By looking at the history of Moab in particular, Ruth was a Moabite, we can quickly see the difficulty that Ruth faced by choosing to return to Judah with Naomi. This third Sunday of Advent, it brings the lighting of the pink candle of joy. The happy ending in Ruth's story that we'll get to today certainly fits the description of joy. Through no fault of her own, Ruth had a complicated backstory because of who her people were, just simply because of the world in which she was born. As a Moabite, Ruth was a foreigner to the Israelites and to their God, but still, she committed to returning to her husband's home country with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth was an outsider to God's people. However, God's story, we know, includes many people who were deemed outsiders. And so I'll remind you of the genealogy of Jesus that we find in Matthew chapter 1. We've read this each of the last 2 weeks. And so we'll read it again. I'm going to read for you simply verse 5. And Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. So we are completing the section now of how King David's lineage is achieved, essentially. And of course, then it goes on in the next several verses to explain how we get from King David to Jesus. But again, Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, who we talked about last week, and then Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. And of course, Ruth and Boaz have a son named Obed, who is the father of Jesse, and we know that Jesse was the father of King David. Though we may have blushed over the last couple of weeks at the stories of Tamar or Rahab, Ruth seems to display these kind of more biblical ideals of womanhood. I want to give you a spoiler alert. If the last two stories were difficult for you, next week is going to be maybe even a bit trickier. But Ruth gives us a little bit of a break here in that her story, while it's complicated for her, it is a little bit easier for us to see really clearly why she would have been included. We name our daughters Ruth. How many women do you know named Rahab? Probably not a lot. Probably not a lot of Tamars. But we name daughters Ruth because of her reputation of faithfulness to God and to her mother-in-law. Now, I might say, maybe we should name some of our daughters Tamar and Rahab, but that's neither here nor there. We know Ruth is a sturdy Bible name, isn't it? We have no doubts that she is worthy of being included in Jesus's genealogy. Nobody ever questions Ruth's inclusion here. But in truth, as a first century reader, one would have had plenty of reservations about including Ruth in the lineage of the Messiah. She was from Moab, a place with this checkered history in relationship to the Israelites. She was the ultimate outsider. Now, back in Deuteronomy chapter 3, it prohibits a Moabite from entering the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation, it says. And earlier passages explain why that hostility was true. In Genesis 19, prior to that, after escaping the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and losing his wife in the process, Lot, remember Lot, the nephew of Abraham, he hides with his two daughters in a cave. For all they know, the world has ended. Now, assuming that they're the last two women on earth, Lot's daughters conspire to become pregnant by their father. So in back-to-back nights, they get Lot drunk, and have sex with him. The son born to the oldest daughter was named Moab. See why this is important? His descendants, Moab's descendants, grew numerous, and they populated the fertile plain of the eastern side of the Jordan River. So later in Numbers chapter 21, it relates the Israelites' experiences near the end of their wilderness journey, which we've studied over the last month or so, as they reached the plains of Moab. At that time, Moab is under the control of the Amorites. When the Amorites refused to permit the Israelites safe passage through their territory, and instead they marched out to attack them, the Israelites defeated them and they claimed their land. Afraid of the Israelites' growing strength, the king of Bashan also marched against them and was also defeated. Other kingdoms in the region began to fear the growing power of the Israelites, right? So by later in Numbers in chapter 22, the kings of Moab and Midian have conspired to hire a prophet named Balaam, you may remember him, to curse the Israelites, but he refuses. So instead, God told Balaam to speak oracles of blessing. He's kind of one of the first prophets. Oracles of blessing on Israel and curses on Moab. So that's where that initial separation between the Israelites and the Moabites really begins. So way back in Deuteronomy and Numbers, that begins. Numbers 25, chapter 25, relates how the Israelite men begin to take Moabite women as lovers and as wives, and they succumb to worshiping Moabite gods, the men did. So as punishment for this infidelity to God, a plague swept through the Israelite camp until Eleazar, who was Aaron's son, remember Moses and his brother Aaron, Aaron's son Eleazar sent a message by killing one of those interracial, intermixed couples with a spear, running through them while they were lying together. So it's pretty violent in the history of the Israelites and the Moabites, and how the Israelites have traditionally treated the Moabites. So Moses, we know, died in Moab on Mount Nebo on the eastern side of the Jordan River Joshua then succeeded him, who we talked about last week. During Joshua's leadership, Moab posed little threat to the Israelites. A generation later, however, in the time of the Judges, the Moabites reasserted themselves under King Eglon. They oppressed the Israelites who made their homes west of the Jordan in the land of Canaan. So again, we're coming back to this unsettled space between these two people. With all that history, it's obvious that the Moabites and the Israelites had a complicated relationship. So how does this story move from Judges chapter 3, where the judge Ehud kills Eglon and overthrows the Moabite oppression, to the story of a Moabite named Ruth, who becomes an ancestor of King David and ultimately of Jesus? So let's look today at Ruth chapter 4. And we're looking at the end, y'all. We're going to look at verses 9 through 17. So Ruth chapter 4, 9 through 17, it says this. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I've acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth, the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses." And all the people who were at the gate along with the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." Like that little shout out to Tamar. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So we're reminded of the end of this story of Ruth. Ruth 1, of course, explains there's a famine in the region. Elimelech and Naomi, originally from Bethlehem in Judah, moved to this fertile region of Moab to find sustenance. We know, because we've heard this story many times, Elimelech dies, leaving his wife Naomi in the care of their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Both of the sons marry Moabites. Mahlon marries Ruth, Chilion marries Orpah. Stick with me here. I know it's a lot of names and a lot of history, but it's valuable. Not long after their marriages, both of Naomi's sons also die, leaving Naomi an heirless widow with heirless widowed daughters-in-law. So when word reaches Naomi that Judah once again has food, she decides to return to her people. And as she leaves, she tells Orpah and Ruth that they are free to go, even though their responsibility is to take care of her. So Orpah remains in Moab, but Ruth commits to stay with Naomi. So that's Ruth chapter 1. That's the part we're familiar with, right? Ruth and Naomi arrive in Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest. Ruth volunteers to go into the fields and gather the leftover grain so that she and Naomi will be able to sustain themselves. Ruth has this work ethic, this devotion to her mother-in-law, and some physical beauty, it definitely says in the first part of Ruth, that catches the eye of the owner of the field, Naomi's relative, Boaz. Now, Boaz then decides to protect Ruth from harm and freely shares his abundance of grain with her. Naomi rejoices when she learns that Ruth has made a connection with her relatives. She expresses thanksgiving to God for this providential meeting. She instructs Ruth on how to win over Boaz. Ruth is to dress up and go to him on the night of the barley threshing floor after the evening meal. So the biblical author, again, as always, please go back and read Ruth. It's only 4 chapters, just to refresh your mind with all of the details of this wonderful story. The biblical author, though, is delicate about telling exactly what happens in this part of the story. Any potentially unseemly details that may have occurred on the threshing floor are omitted. So when Boaz awakens in the middle of the night, all we know is that he sees Ruth sleeping beside him. And he alleviates her fear, and he assures her that he will take her to be his wife, and he will claim Elimelech's inheritance so that it can stay within her family. Well, Naomi's family. There is, however, another relative with a stronger claim who has to be consulted. So Boaz wastes no time in taking the matter to this unnamed relative before the town elders, which is where we see ourselves in chapter 4. Excuse me. The other relatives seem eager to have Elimelech's property, but when he realizes he'd have to marry Ruth, who is a Moabite, he backs out. He doesn't want any part of that. So this leaves Boaz with Elimelech's property, with that inheritance, and Ruth as his wife. Boaz and Ruth, as it says, have a son named Obed, and Naomi helps raise this long-awaited heir that she believed she did not have the chance to have anymore. But Ruth gives her this gift of a grandson whom she becomes the nurse and caregiver for. So, Naomi's husband Elimelech's line continues, ultimately producing Jesse and his son, Israel's great king, David. So, when you think about the story of Ruth, and I am going to invite you to think back on what you know of the chapters that we didn't read today, what gave Ruth's life meaning? What would you say was her motivation? What drove her? What was Ruth's purpose? What do you think the answer might be to that? Ruth's decision to stake her future with Naomi, that was a choice that she made, a purposeful choice, had results that were far beyond their wildest dreams. Ruth gave up the faith of her Moabite people in order to follow the Israelite God. She made a choice to leave the comfort of her family to which she could have returned in exchange for creating a new family that would ultimately produce the Messiah. Naomi's life was filled with tragedy. Famine, immigration, widowhood, the death of her sons. There are people like Naomi all around us. They are suffering in unimaginable ways. And all too often, those who suffer are invisible to us. And yet Ruth does not let Naomi become invisible. Ruth's intention and purpose and drive is to lift up her mother-in-law, to care for her mother-in-law, to not let her mother-in-law be cast aside as a widow might have been, but instead she says, no, I will stay with you in this hardship. I will suffer with you in this time. There are people all around us who suffer, and they're invisible to us. We can't see their needs or imagine how we can stand with them, though, if our focus is on ourselves. This is not to say Orpah made the wrong choice. She did the thing culturally that was okay to do, but Ruth just took it the next step. Ruth saw the need and said, I can't turn my eyes to this. I have to do something else. It can't be about me. I want to say that again. We can't see needs or imagine how we can stand by those in need if our focus is on ourselves. Ruth's focus is not on herself. If we want to truly experience joy this Advent season, we must see people who need us to stand with them and to commit to go where they go, as Ruth says to Naomi. Ruth is one of the names of the amazing women in the genealogy of Jesus. And honestly, friends, I think she is a precursor to the message of Jesus. That's what's important for us to remember about all of these women. What do their lives tell us about who Christ was? And if Ruth is to tell us who Jesus is, it is one who sees needs and does something about it. It is one who puts others above self. That is what Ruth taught through this story. And surely that story that was passed down from this time all the way to the genealogy, and now it must have value if it continued to be told over and over. And so, of course, Jesus himself must have heard this story of this woman, his great something grandmother, who put the needs of others above self. What a bold inspiration that is for us during Advent and the rest of the year as well. Your homework this week is to think of people that you know or you encounter who have needs, and invite God to show you how to meet those needs, how to look beyond yourself to meet the needs of others. Let's pray. Oh God, we thank you for this genealogy of Jesus, for those who went before him, whose stories he likely heard and whose stories we hear now as reminders of your goodness in this world. God, we especially thank you for Ruth and for Naomi. We thank you for Boaz. We thank you for this story that reminds us that we can only see and address the needs of others when we are not thinking about ourselves. Convict our hearts, Lord, so that we might open our eyes and our imaginations so that we might be more like your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, friends, next week will be the last week in Advent, and we will, of course, be considering love that week. I want to tell you, we will again look at the genealogy, and then we will be in 2 Samuel chapter 11. I'm not even going to tell you who that is. If you want to read ahead, you certainly can. And I want to let you know that it's a little more difficult of a lesson. Yeah, it is. And so if it's a little bit too hard for you or a little bit touchy for you, I respect that. And if you need to sit out for a week, that's okay. And yet, it is a really important lesson, a really valuable lesson. It's a perspective on a very old story that I want us to have our eyes and ears opened to next week. So again, we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 11. If you want to read ahead, you can, and you'll know who I'm talking about. But I do hope you will be here next week, because here's the thing. This book is full of stories of people, and people are messy, and people make poor choices, and yet God can redeem it, God can use it, and God has used this book to teach us and to show us exactly how we're called to live in this world and how we're called not to live. So keep that in mind if you go ahead and read ahead. I look forward to being with you next week as we continue studying